There are questions a child asks that mean nothing. And there are questions a child asks that quietly split a man's whole life into a before and an after. Charles Ashford was about to hear one of the second kind. He just didn't know it yet. It was a few days before Christmas, and the pediatric wing of St. Clair's Children's Hospital had been turned, for one afternoon, into something close to magic. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling on invisible thread. Silver garland looped along the nurses' station. Volunteers in Santa hats carried trays of cocoa down the halls, and a long line of children wound through the ward, each one waiting for a wrapped gift from the man at the center of it all. Charles handed out the presents himself. He always did. His foundation paid for half the programs on that floor, and once a year he came in person, knelt down to the children's level, and put each gift into small hands while the cameras flashed around him. Beside him stood his daughter, Nia. 6 years old, in a red velvet dress, with her mother's warm brown skin and her mother's stubborn chin, and her father's pale crescent birthmark on the inside of her left wrist. She had come to help. Mostly she had come to watch, wide-eyed, as her father became, for one afternoon, the closest thing a billionaire ever gets to being a hero in a paper crown. A mother pressed forward. Amy Rasford, my daughter's next, could we get one photo? A boy tugged a sleeve. I want the dinosaur, please. The room hummed with voices and laughter and the bright nervous joy of children who do not get many afternoons like this one. Then Nia tugged on his sleeve. Daddy. Charles handed a toy truck to a grinning boy without looking down. One moment, sweetheart. But Daddy. What? She tugged harder. And something in the pull of it made him glance down. Nia was not pouting. She was not asking for a cookie, or a turn, or any of the small things children ask for. Her face had gone serious, in the way a child's face goes serious only when she has noticed something the adults have missed. What is it? He asked. She pointed toward the back of the line. That boy over there. He has a birthmark, exactly like mine. Charles blinked. The comment was strange enough to break clean through his concentration. Does he now? He said, half amused. Yes. On his wrist. The same one. He followed the line of her finger, but the crowd was thick, and he couldn't see clearly. So he straightened, handed the stack of remaining gifts to a volunteer, and said, "Take over for me a moment." Then he took his daughter's hand. "Show me." Nia brightened at once, and pulled him through the crowd toward the back of the room. "There," she whispered. "Blue sweater." And Charles saw him. A small boy, no older than 4, stood near the window beside a tired woman in a worn brown coat. He was up on his toes, craning to see how close he was getting to the front. In his excitement he had pushed both sleeves of his sweater halfway up his arms. Charles's eyes dropped to the boy's left wrist, out of an instinct he could not have named. The boy noticed them coming and shrank closer to his mother, his small shoulders tightening, looking up with the wary, uncertain expression children wear when a powerful stranger turns toward them for no reason they understand. Nia smiled first. She was good at that. "Ha," she said brightly. The boy blinked. "Ha." She pointed at his arm, with the blunt honesty only children can manage. "You have a birthmark like me." Then she thrust out her own wrist, proud as anything. "See. Mine looks just like yours." The boy looked down at his arm. "I do." Charles crouched slowly, to make himself smaller, less of a tower. His voice came out gentle. "Hey there. Would you mind showing me your wrist for just a second?" The boy glanced up at his mother. And she stiffened at once. "It's only a birthmark," she said, far too quickly. Charles held her gaze for half a beat. Then he looked back at the child, and kept his voice soft. "It may be," he said. "But would you show me anyway?" The little boy hesitated. Then, slowly, he lifted his arm. And Charles, kneeling there on the bright tile floor of a children's hospital, felt the ground tilt beneath him. There, on the inside of the boy's wrist, was a pale crescent-shaped birthmark. Identical Tonias. Identical to his own, hidden right then beneath the cuff of his watch. For one suspended moment, the noise of the hospital fell away entirely. The music, the laughter, the cameras, all of it sank beneath the surface, and Charles stared at that small curved mark as though the world itself had quietly cracked open along a seam he had never known was there. Because that mark was not random. That mark was Ashford blood. It was a trait that had run through his family for 4 generations. His grandfather had carried it. His father had carried it, beneath a watch much like his own. He carried it. His daughter carried it, passed down to her along with her mother's smile. And long ago, his younger brother had carried it too. Daddy, Nia whispered. Charles did not answer. He stared at the child's wrist while something cold and very old opened up inside his chest, and his mind raced, refusing what his own eyes were plainly telling him. Daddy, you see it now, right? Nia asked, more softly. He swallowed hard. Yes, he said at last. The word came out rough. Nia frowned up at him. Why do you look scared? He forced himself to breathe. He rose slowly, every movement measured, controlled, because only years of discipline kept the tremor out of his voice. What's your name, son? He asked. The boy shifted nervously. Maike. That's a good name. Charles nodded once. And how old are you, Maike? 4. The boy held up the right number of fingers, very seriously. 4. Younger than Nia. Charles has moved to the woman beside the boy. She stood rigid now, one hand resting on her son's shoulder with the quiet tension of someone ready to pull him away at the first hint of danger. And your name? He asked. She hesitated. Then answered, carefully. Rena. Rena Hoyowai. He repeated it silently. Rena Hoyowai. Beside them, Nia had already crouched down to hold her wrist up next to Maike's, comparing the 2 marks with pure delight. We really match, she breathed. Maike looked down at the 2 small crescents, side by side, and gave a slow, astonished nod. We do. Charles looked from the children, to their wrists, to the woman in the worn brown coat. And the warmth drained slowly out of his face. Because Charles Ashford was standing in the middle of a crowded children's hospital, 3 days before Christmas, staring at a little boy who carried his family's blood on his skin. And he had never, in 4 years, known the child existed. For several seconds, Charles did not move. The crowd churned around him. A camera flashed somewhere. None of it reached him. Then he straightened to his full height, every inch of his posture composed, despite the storm turning behind his eyes. Miss Holloway, he said evenly. Would you and your son come with me, just for a moment? There is a quieter room down the hall. I'd like to ask you about that birthmark. Her answer came back instantly, sharp enough to make Mia blink. No. Charles kept his voice level. I'm not trying to frighten you. No, she said again. Maike looked up between the 2 adults, confused by the tension that had dropped over them out of nowhere. Nia stepped closer to him and smiled, trying, in the way children do, to fix what the grown-ups had complicated. Nia, by the way, she said. The boy looked at her shyly. That's a cool name. Thank you. She beamed. Charles' gaze never left Renee Holloway. Miss Holloway, he said, quieter now. Please. If I'm wrong about what I think I'm seeing, then this conversation ends in 5 minutes, and you walk away, and you never have to see me again. I let the sentence rest a moment. But if I'm not wrong, then this matters more than you can possibly know right now. Something in his tone reached past her guard. She studied him for a long moment, weighing him the way a woman weighs a stranger who has suddenly become dangerous, or important, or both. Then she gave a single, reluctant nod. All right. 5 minutes. Charles exhaled. Thank you. He led them to a small alcove at the far end of the floor, away from the cameras and the holiday crowd. A row of pale blue chairs sat beneath tall windows that looked out over the snowy Chicago streets below. Nia climbed into the seat next to Micah at once, already talking to him as if they had been friends for years. My dad has a giant Christmas tree at our house, she informed him proudly. Mika's eyes went round. How? Giant? Taller than the stairs? Way taller. No way. Charles sat down across from Renee. Now that the crowd was gone, the fear in her face had nowhere left to hide. He kept his voice low and even. Tell me the truth, he said. Where did your son get that birthmark? Renee looked down at her clasped hands. For several long seconds, she said nothing at all. Then, very quietly, from his father. Charlie's chest tightened. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. And who was his father? She lifted her eyes to his. Jonathan Ashford, she said. The name struck him like a physical blow. Charlie sat frozen in the pale blue chair. Across from him, Nia and Micah had drifted into a serious negotiation about which Christmas cookies were the best kind, entirely oblivious. When his voice finally came, it came out rough. Say that again. Renee swallowed. Micah's father was Jonathan Ashford. For one suspended moment, Charles could not speak. He simply stared at her. Then, finally, the only words he could find. How do you know that name? Renee gave a small, hollow laugh. Because I loved him. Charles leaned back slowly in his chair, as the past shifted under him like ground in an earthquake. And now he saw it. He looked at the little boy again, really looked, and there it was. Jonathan's face, in miniature. The same wide sad eyes. The same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. His throat closed. When, he asked quietly. When did you know him? Renee glanced toward Micah before she answered. 7 years ago I was working nights at a diner out near the edge of the city. He came in every Thursday. Coffee and pie, always the same. Tipped too much, because he decided I worked too hard. A faint, broken smile touched her lips. He told me his family had money. And that they wanted nothing to do with him anymore. Charles closed his eyes for a moment. That sounded exactly like Jonathan. He said he'd chosen the wrong woman, by his family's standards, Renee went on, her voice soft with memory. Wrong neighborhood. Wrong family. Wrong everything. The smile faded. But he said he didn't care. Charlie's jaw tightened. Of course. Their father had always cared far more about pedigree than about happiness. Jonathan left home for you, he said. It was not quite a question. Renee nodded. He walked away from everything. Nia, half listening now, looked up and frowned. Wait. Mika's daddy had the same last name as us. Charles looked at her. Renee looked stricken. Did Micah's daddy know you, Daddy? Nia asked. Charlie's voice came out gentle. He was my brother, sweetheart. Nia's eyes went wide. That means, Charles said slowly, that Micah might be your cousin. Nia gasped, as though she had just been handed the single greatest gift of her entire life. I have a cousin? Micah stared at her, stunned. What's a cousin? It's family, Nia explained, with great authority. But not a brother. Even better, kind of. That sounds cool, Micah decided. Renee pressed trembling fingers to her mouth. Charles forced himself to focus. Tell me everything, he said. Please. Renee gathered herself, eyes down. Jonathan and I lived together almost a year. We were broke. But we were happy. Then I found out I was pregnant. Her voice cracked, just slightly. He cried when I told him. Actually cried. And he said he wanted to come back here. He wanted to make peace with the family before the baby came. He kept saying his brother would understand. That if anyone would, it was you. Charles felt those words go into him like a blade. He said that. He said it all the time. Renee's eyes were shining now. He loved you. Even after everything they did. It never stopped. Charles had to look away. But before he could come back, Renee continued, very quietly, he got sick. It happened fast. Faster than anyone thought it would. Charles turned back sharply. Sick. She nodded, and the tears came now, sliding down without permission. Very sick. By the time we understood what it was, there wasn't much they could do. Jonathan died before Micah was even born. The words pulled all the air out of the room. Because that was not the story. That was not the story the family had been told. Charles stared at her. That's not what I heard, he said. Renee gave a bitter, exhausted laugh. Then somebody lied to you. And the blood in. Charles Ashford's veins turned slowly to ice. He thought of the phone call from years ago back. Rushed. The family attorneys who had handled everything before he could ask a single real question. His father, calm and final, telling him there had been an accident, that it was done, that grief was a private thing and the family did not air it. His father. His father had buried this. Charles' hands curled slowly into fists in his lap. They now watched him, careful. I never told anyone, after he died. Jonathan said your family would never accept me. Never accept our son. So I believed him. He disappeared. It seemed safer. You should have told me, Charles said. But there was no anger in it. Only something hollow. Her eyes flashed. Why? So your rich, powerful family could come and take my baby, because he shares your blood? She leaned forward, her voice shaking now. Do you have any idea what it's like to raise a child alone, while every system in the world tells you you're not enough? To choose between rent and his medicine? To sit up at night listening to him breathe, and pray he makes it another year? The tears were falling freely now. I had one thing left that was mine, for. One thing Jonathan gave me. He was not going to risk losing him too. Charles said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound like an excuse. Beside them, Nia took Micah's hand with the complete certainty of a 6-year-old who has decided how the world will now be arranged. Well, she announced. If you're my cousin, you have to come see the giant Christmas tree. Micah looked up at his mother. Can he? Renee laughed, wet and broken, through her tears. Charles stared at the two children. At his brother's son, sitting beside his daughter. At the impossible, undeniable fact of him. His brother had died believing the family had thrown him away. A woman had raised that brother's child alone, in fear and in poverty, while a little boy carrying Ashford blood grew up 4 years deep without a single soul in his father's family knowing he was alive. Charles swallowed hard. Then he looked Renee Holloway in the eye, and spoke with a quiet that carried more weight than any. Bramis shouted from a rooftop. You have my word, he said. No one is taking him from you. Not me. Not anyone. Renee studied his face, searching it for the lie she had spent 4 years expecting from people like him. Charles lowered his voice further. I failed my brother once. I am not going to fail his son. That night, long after Nia had been tucked into bed and the great halls of the Ashford house had gone quiet, Charles did not sleep. He sat alone in his study, the lights low, the city glowing far beyond the windows. A glass of whiskey stood untouched at his elbow. In his hands he held an old framed photograph he had not looked at in years. Jonathan smiled out of it with the careless confidence of a younger brother who still believed the world would bend to him. One arm slung over Charles's shoulder. Both of them tanned and grinning on some long-forgotten summer afternoon by the lake, both certain the future belonged to them and always would. Charles stared at his brother's face until his eyes blurred. Then he looked away. For years he had told himself a comfortable story. That grief becomes manageable if you only stay busy enough. Work long enough hours. Sign enough contracts. Buy enough buildings. Attend enough galas. Eventually the ache dulls into something quiet and respectable, and you call that healing. Tonight he understood it had been a lie. Because tonight grief was no longer a memory. It had a face. A small, solemn face, with wide brown eyes and a pale crescent on its wrist. Jonathan's son. The word still would not sit right in his mind. A soft knock came at the door. Come in. Mrs. Dale entered with a tray, fresh coffee and a plate of shortbread no one would eat. She had kept this house for 30 years. One look at him, and her face softened. You haven't moved in 2 hours, she said. Charles set down the photograph. I'm not hungry. I wasn't asking about the cookies. She crossed the room and set the tray on the desk. Then her eyes fell on Jonathan's picture, and her voice gentled. You loved him very much. Charles gave a short, humorless laugh. I spent half my life arguing with him. That isn't what I said. He leaned back, the exhaustion showing through the cracks in his composure. He was infuriating. Reckless. Stubborn as a mule. He thought every rule in the world existed only to be broken by him personally. Mrs. Dale smiled faintly. Sounds like someone. Charles ignored that. His gaze drifted back to the photograph. He was also the only one in this family who ever said exactly what he meant. No politics. No performance. No pretending. His voice dropped. He deserved better than what we gave him. Mrs. Dale said nothing, because there was nothing in it to argue with. Their father had run the Ashford family like a small, cold kingdom, and kingdoms do not forgive disobedience. When Jonathan refused to leave Renee, the punishment had been swift. His trust frozen. His cards cancelled. His name quietly scrubbed from the family business, and from every social circle that mattered. Charles had objected, in private. But not enough. Never enough. He had told himself there would be time to fix it later. There always seemed to be time. Right up until there wasn't. His phone buzzed against the desk. He grabbed it instantly. Ray Donnelly. Talk to me, Charles said. Ray's voice came low and steady through the speaker. He had been Charles's private investigator for 15 years, and he did not waste words. I've got preliminary findings. Charles straightened. Go. Renee Holloway is clean. No criminal record. No drugs, no fraud, nothing. She works 2 jobs. Wets tables in the evenings, does the books for a small plumbing outfit in the mornings. 1-bedroom apartment on the south side. Charles' jaw tightened. And the book? Medical records line up with what she told you. Mika's got a heart condition. Congenital. Needs ongoing treatment, possibly surgery down the line. She's behind on the bills for it. Charles closed his eyes briefly. Anything else? A pause. Ray hesitated, which Ray almost never did. There's more. It's about Jonathan. Charles has opened. What about him? The official story your family was given. It doesn't hold up. Eyes moved slowly down Charles's spine. Explain. There's no accident report for a Jonathan Ashford anywhere near the date your father's office recorded. No police file. No coroner's record. No hospital emergency intake under their cause of death. Ray paused. None of it exists, boss. Charles stood up slowly. What are you telling me? I'm telling you the story your family got was not the truth. Ray's voice stayed even, but careful. I found private hospice records. Jonathan was admitted under a different name, 6 years ago late-stage leukemia. Charles stopped breathing. Leukemia. He turned slowly toward the dark window, the city lights smearing into long gold streaks. Rena had told the truth. Jonathan had not died fast, in some sudden, merciful accident. He had wasted away, slowly, over months. And no one had told him. Ray's voice softened, just slightly. Boss. Charles swallowed. Keep talking. The hospice notes say a woman named Renee Holloway stayed with him until the end. She was 7 months pregnant when he passed. Charles pressed his hand flat against the desk, because he could suddenly see it, far too clearly. Jonathan, dying in some quiet room under a false name, while Renee sat beside him carrying his unborn son. No family. No brother. No one from home. Because someone had made very certain they would never know. There's one more thing, Ray said. Financial records show your father's personal attorney handled every arrangement. Quiet burial. Sealed records. No public obituary. Nothing. Charlie's expression went to stone. His father. Even from the grave, the old man still knew exactly how to wound. He buried the truth with him, Charles said quietly. Ray didn't answer. It didn't need to. Charlie ended the call and stood motionless in the silence that followed. Mrs. Dale watched him carefully. What happened? It turned, his face pale with a fury he had not felt in years. My father lied to all of us. Hair brow furrowed. About what? He told us Jonathan died in an accident. Sadin. Panless. Charlie's voice sharpened with every word. He didn't. Jonathan had leukemia. He was dying for months. My father knew, and he made sure I never found out. Mrs. Dale stared at him in disbelief. Why would he do such a thing? Charles laughed, low and bitter. Because Jonathan chose the wrong woman. Because he embarrassed the family. Because in my father's world, disobedience deserved exile. His eyes darkened. And apparently, exile didn't end at death. The room fell silent. Charles looked down at his brother's photograph. And for the first time in years, the grief inside him twisted into something hotter. Anger. Not at Jonathan. Not at Renee. At his father, who had done it. And at himself, who had believed it. He had accepted the lie because it was easy. Part of him had wanted to believe Jonathan simply wanted no contact, because that was less painful than the truth, that his brother had been left to die alone while pride kept the door shut. He sank slowly back into the chair. He was dying, he whispered. And I didn't know. Mrs. Dale's voice gentled. You couldn't have known. I should have. His voice cracked. He was my brother. He stared at the photograph with hollow eyes. All that time, I told myself he chose to stay away. He swallowed hard. He wasn't staying away. He was trying to survive. Trying to build a family. Trying to come home. His voice dropped to almost nothing. And I never once went looking for him. The truth of it sat between them in the dim study like a stone too heavy to lift. Upstairs, faint through the half-open nursery monitor, Nia laughed in her sleep at something only she could see. And the sound broke something loose in Charles's chest. Because Jonathan should have had that. Jonathan should have had nights spent listening to his son laugh through a wall. He should have lived to teach Micah how to ride a bike, how to throw a baseball, how to tie a tie badly the morning of a school dance. Instead, a little boy with Ashford blood was growing up in a cramped apartment with a fragile heart, while the family that should have surrounded him with everything never even knew his name. Charlie stood up abruptly. Mrs. Dale blinked. Where are you going? He was already reaching for his coat. To start fixing what my family broke, he said. Tonight. 25 minutes later, his car rolled slowly through the south side, beneath streetlights that turned the icy roads to streaks of gold. Ray had sent the address. Ejet. The building was older than any building should be that people still lived in, brick darkened by decades. Paint peeling near the stairwell. A single exterior light flickering over the entrance, fighting the cold. Charlie sat in the car for a moment, looking up at it. His brother's son lived here. His nephew. An Ashford by blood, sleeping under a leaking roof in a neighborhood his family would never once have driven through on purpose. The shame of that closed his throat. He climbed the stairs and knocked. Inside, he heard movement. A pause. Then the door opened, and René's face registered pure shock. Me for. He stood there in his dark coat, the winter wind at his back, his eyes carrying more weight than they had that afternoon. We need to talk, he said. René hesitated. Then she stepped aside and let him in. The apartment was painfully small. A worn couch. A tiny kitchen. A space heater humming against one wall. In the corner, toys were stacked with care beside a short row of children's books, their spines mended with tape. And on the couch, beneath a blanket printed with dinosaurs, Micah slept, one stuffed toy tucked under his chin. Charlie stared at him. Jonathan's son. So small. So entirely unaware of the war of guilt and grief raging in the man standing over him. René closed the door softly. What happened? Charles turned to her. And for the first time in years, his voice carried no corporate polish, no billionaire precision. Only the raw, plain sound of a man in pain. My father knew Jonathan was dying, he said. And he kept it from me. The anger René had been carrying for 4 years softened, just a fraction. Charles's eyes moved back to the sleeping boy. He died believing his own family had abandoned him. He did, René whispered. He waited. Right up until the end, he kept hoping somebody would come. Her voice broke. Nobody came. The words cut deeper than anything Ray had read him over the phone. Charlie swallowed hard. Then he looked at her, with a quiet certainty that had settled over him somewhere on the drive across the city. I can't change what happened to Jonathan, he said, his voice rough. God knows I would give anything to. But I can change what happens next. René's breath caught. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so as not to wake the boy. I meant every word I said this afternoon. No one is taking him from you. His gaze flicked to Micah. But that child is my family. My brother's son. And whether you trust me or not, I am not walking away from him a second time. René stared at him in silence for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. René Holloway did not trust easily. Charles understood that within minutes. She offered him the one chair not buried under folded laundry, then stayed standing herself, arms crossed tight, as though sitting down might give away ground she couldn't afford to lose. He lowered himself into the chair slowly, taking in the room with the quiet attention of a man cataloging every detail. The place was clean despite its age. No battles. No chaos. No neglect. Only wear. The particular wear of people surviving one hard month at a time. René noticed him looking. If you're trying to decide whether I'm a bad mother because I'm poor, she said coldly, save it. Charles met her eyes. I'm trying to understand how you've done all of this alone. That caught her off guard. Her folded arms loosened, just slightly. Barely, she admitted, after a moment. His gaze went back to the couch. How bad is his heart? René's whole face tightened, fear and exhaustion rising together. Bad enough that I memorized the sound of it. The doctors say he'll need surgery. A good surgeon, a good hospital. The kind I can't get to from where I'm standing. Her voice hardened to keep it from shaking. I've got him on a waiting list. We've been on it 11 months. Charles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, simply, he won't be on it after tonight. René's eyes snapped to his. I don't want your charity. It isn't charity. A held her gaze. Charity is for strangers. A is my brother's son. A let that settle. There's a difference, and I think you know it. She turned away toward the dark window, blinking fast. You don't get to show up after 4 years and decide you're the hero. No, Charles agreed. I don't. And I'm not trying to be. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. I'm trying to be a little less of the man who let his brother die alone. His voice dropped. That's all. That's the whole of it. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The space heater ticked. The wind pressed at the glass. Then René sat down, finally, on the edge of the couch beside her sleeping son, and rested one hand lightly on his small back, feeling for the rhythm there the way she must have done 10,000 times before. "He likes dinosaurs," she said quietly. "Not quite a surrender. But something near it. The green ones especially. He thinks the green ones are the bravest." Charles felt the corner of something unclench in his chest. "Jonathan was the same way as a kid," he said. "Decided one color was braver than the others, and you couldn't talk him out of it for love or money." "Ah, Ismael," surprised sound escaped Renee. Alpha laugh. "Hair first. Tell me about him," she said. "The boy version. Maike only ever got the stories I had. They like to have more." So Charles did. He sat in that cramped apartment past midnight, and he gave Renee Holloway the brother she had loved as a boy. The reckless one. The funny one. The one who climbed the wrong trees and said the wrong things to the right people and made their cold father furious in a dozen creative ways. And as he talked, the wall around Renee did not fall, exactly. But the door opened in it. Used enough to let a little warmth pass through. When he finally rose to leave, near 1 in the morning, he paused at the door. "I'll have a specialist call you tomorrow," he said. "Not a stranger. The best pediatric cardiac surgeon in the state. And whatever it costs, in money or in time, it is handled. You will never see a bill." He met her eyes. "That part isn't a kindness. It's the bare minimum. The kindness comes after." Renee's voice was barely a whisper. "Why?" Charles looked back at the boy on the couch, at the small crescent on his wrist just visible beneath the blanket. "Because somebody in this family should have come a long time ago," he said. "And I'm the one who's left to do it." What followed did not happen all at once. Trust never does. The surgery came first. Micah was admitted to the cardiac unit at St. Clair's in the new year, under the care of the surgeon Charles had promised. Renee did not leave the hospital for 3 days. And Charles, to her quiet astonishment, was there too. Not for the cameras. There were no cameras. He sat in the waiting room in an ordinary sweater, holding cold coffee, while a machine somewhere beyond the doors kept time over his brother's only child. When the surgeon came out at last and said the word stable, Renee folded forward in her chair and wept into her hands, and Charles did the only thing left to do. He sat down beside her, and let her, and did not try to fix it, because some things are not meant to be fixed, only witnessed. Nia visited every day after school. She brought Micah drawings, and updates on the giant Christmas tree, which had been taken down by then, a fact she reported with great personal disappointment. She held his hand through the rail of the hospital bed and told him, with total seriousness, that cousins were required by law to share dessert. And slowly, week by week, the two families that had been one family all along began to fold back into each other. There was an older woman in all of this, though. Ellen Asford. Charlie's mother. Jonathan's mother. She had survived her cold husband by several years, and she had carried her own quiet share of the lie, though hers had been the lie of a woman who suspected, and was afraid to ask, and let fear win. When Charles told her the truth, the whole of it, she did not defend herself. She simply asked, in a voice gone thin, to meet the boy. The day Helen Ashford met her grandson, she knelt down on the floor of that south side apartment in a coat that cost more than the building's monthly rent, and she took Micah's small hand, and turned it over, and looked at the crescent on his wrist. The same mark she had kissed on her own son's wrist 40 years before. "Oh," she said. "Just that. Oh, there you are." And Maike, who did not understand any of it, looked up at the crying old woman and offered her his green dinosaur, because the green ones were the bravest, and bravery seemed to be what the moment called for. She called him a treasure. He called her, a few weeks later, without thinking, Grandma. And Helen Ashford wept away only the very old weep, quietly, as if the tears had been saved a long time for exactly this. The months that followed taught Charles Ashford something his whole education had somehow missed. That repair is not a single grand gesture. It is 1,000 ordinary ones, repeated, until the people on the other end stopped bracing for them to stop. I learned the route to the south side by heart. I learned that Micah liked his toast cut into triangles and refused it cut into squares, on principle. I learned that Renee took her coffee black and her help in small doses, and that pushing too much too fast undid a month of progress in an afternoon. I learned to move slowly. To show up, and keep showing up, and ask for nothing. And somewhere in all of it, without either of them quite deciding when, the visits stopped being about obligation, and the dinners stopped being about the boy, and the silences between Charles and Renee stopped being heavy and started being easy. I was not a man who fell quickly. I had spent 30 years measuring everything before he reached for it. But he found himself, more and more, simply wanting to be in the rooms she was in, not to manage them. Not to fund them. Just to be there, when she laughed, which was rare, and worth the wait. What grew between them grew the way the strongest things grow. Slowly. Wee steep roots. Out of the unlikely soul of a shared grief, and a shared boy, and a shared refusal to let pride win twice. By the time summer came, the apartment on the south side stood empty. Renee had not surrendered her independence so much as finally found a place safe enough to set part of it down. She and Micah moved into the Ashford house, into rooms that had stood echoing and unused for years, and the great cold halls that Charles's father had ruled by silence began, for the first time in living memory, to fill with the sound of children running where they were not supposed to. They married in the gardens, in late summer, with the lights strung through the trees and the people who mattered standing in the grass. There was no press. There was no spectacle. There was only family, the real kind, the kind that is chosen and earned and fought for, watching two people who had each arrived at love the long way around. Nia declared, to anyone who would listen, that she had personally planned the entire wedding. Aileen held Micah in her lap during the slow songs and cried openly when he leaned back against her without thinking, the way a child leans only on people he has decided are safe. And Charles, standing at the front, very nearly lost his composure entirely when he made his vow, not only to Renee, but quietly, in his own heart, to a brother who should have stood beside him that day, and didn't. Late that night, after the music had faded and the children had been carried up to bed in a tangle of formal clothes and exhaustion, Charles slipped away for a moment of quiet. He found himself in the upstairs hall, in front of a portrait of Jonathan he had hung there months before, in the place of honor the old man had always denied him. He looked at it a long time. I hope we did right by them, he said softly into the empty corridor. The silence that answered was not an empty silence. It was the other kind. The kind that settles over a man when he finally lays down a burden he has carried so long he forgot it was not part of his own body. It touched the frame once. And as he turned to go, he found Micah standing barefoot behind him in the dark, half asleep, dragging a pillow. You okay? Charles whispered. Micah nodded. Then, with the devastating directness of the very young, he asked the question. Can I call you Dad now? Charles went still. For a moment, every sound in the world seemed to stop. He crouched down slowly, to the boy's level. Only if you want to, he said. Micah looked at him with complete, unblinking sincerity. I want to. And whatever composure Charles Ashford had left, after 30 years of building walls high enough to keep out everything, finally gave way. He pulled the boy into his arms and held him tight. Then yes, he whispered, his voice gone rough. Yes. You can. Micah yawned against his shoulder, already drifting back toward sleep. Okay, Ad. And as Charles carried his son back to bed through the quiet halls of a house that had once been full of ghosts, he understood something he could not have explained to the man he had been a year before. That some prayers arrive disguised as heartbreak. And that some of the great turnings of a life begin with nothing more than a child, brave enough to ask a question no one expects. Daddy, why does that boy have a birthmark like mine? That autumn, Charles legally adopted Micah. The hearing was private, by request. No press. No spectacle. Used family, on a row of wooden benches, in a quiet courtroom. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes, reviewed the paperwork, then looked over her glasses at the small boy swinging his legs beneath the bench. Young man, she said. Do you understand what adoption means? Mike nodded, proud. It means he picks me. Forever. The courtroom went very quiet. Rena pressed a hand to her mouth. Ellen cried without trying to hide it. Even the judge blinked several times and cleared her throat before she could answer. Yes, she said softly. That is exactly what it means. Then she signed the order. And in the space of a single afternoon, Micah Holloway became Micah Ashford, and the name that pride had once erased was carried forward, into the future, by a child who carried his father's mark on his wrist. Outside on the courthouse steps, Nia tackled him in a hug. You're officially stuck with us now, she informed him. Mike agreed. Good. The years carried on, the way years do. People in the city would tell stories about Charles Ashford, in time. They would talk about the billionaire who rebuilt the Southside pediatric wing where his nephew's heart had been mended. They would talk about the scholarships he funded, in his brother's name, for children from the neighborhoods his family had once refused to drive through. They would talk about the way Ashford Holdings, under his hand, slowly began to value people over appearances, in a way the old man never would have allowed. They would call him generous. Visionary. Changed. But the few who knew him best understood the truth. Charles Ashford had not become a better man because of his money. He became a better man because, on an ordinary December afternoon, a little girl in a red dress tugged on his sleeve in a crowded hospital, and asked him, simply, to look. On winter nights, years later, when the children were taller and the house glowed warm against the snow, Charles would sometimes stand at the top of the stairs and listen. Nia practicing the piano, badly, with great confidence. Mike arguing with a tutor about something he was certain he was right about. Rena laughing somewhere below, the clatter of dishes, the ordinary music of a full house. And every time, the same thought would come to him. A man can spend half his life building an empire, and still not understand what wealth is. Then one day, a child calls him dad. And all at once, he knows. Because in the end, the greatest inheritance Charles Ashford ever claimed was not his father's fortune. It was the family he very nearly lost, before he learned how to love them. And under the roof of a house once ruled by pride, and by silence, a different kind of legacy finally took root. Not power. Not status. Not fear. Only this one quiet truth, learned far too late, and just barely in time. That blood may make people relatives. But love is what makes them family. This story is a reminder that real family is not built by wealth, or status, or blood alone. It is built by love, and loyalty, and the courage to choose one another when it would be easier not to. It is a reminder that pride and silence can quietly destroy the people we are meant to protect, while truth and compassion can heal wounds we believed would never close. Sometimes the people we fail cannot be brought back. Jonathan could not be brought back. But we can still honor the ones we lost by loving, fiercely and without hesitation, the people they left behind. Justice, in the end, is not only about exposing what was done in the dark. It is about choosing to make things right, while there is still a little time left to do it. And the greatest legacy any of us can leave behind is not the money we gather, or the names we carve into walls. It is the love we set loose in the family we build, a love that goes on, long after we are gone, in the people who learned, because of us, how to stay. This is a work of fiction, created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are imagined. They do not represent any real people, or any true story. This content is intended for storytelling and reflection only.